Hello, my name is Connor Quinlan, and in this review I'm going to be doing a comparison between these four ultra wide angles for FX cameras. Here I have the Nikon 14mm f-stop 2.8 fixed lens, the Nikon 16 to 35mm f-stop 4 lens, the Nikon 17 to 35mm f-stop 2.8 lens, and finally the Nikon 14 to 24mm f-stop 2.8 lens. What I'm going to do in this review is I'm going to go through each one and talk about each of their qualities and their faults. And in the end, I'm going to recommend which lenses I would use for what, and which ones are the best for those of you who have FX cameras and are looking for an ultra-wide FX lens. First one I'm going to review is the Nikon 14mm fixed lens. Now what I really like about this lens and what sticks out most is simply how nice and compact it is. It's the smallest lens here, it's also the lightest lens here, and it's really easy to carry around and really fun to use because of its size. It's definitely a ton lighter than the 14 to 24mm, and even though it is an older lens, it's still pretty easy to use. It does have this older feature that you have to, instead of having manual override, you have to switch it from auto to manual focus by pushing this button and turning this ring. And it also has the older aperture ring, but other than that, it's definitely a fun lens to use and very good size. The disadvantages to this lens is that it is quite a bit softer, especially than the 14 to 24mm at the same focal length, and it does have extensive vignetting when wide open. Those are some of the disadvantages of this lens. Next lens is the 16 to 35mm f-stop 4 zoom lens. One thing I really do like about this lens is, once again, this is one of the newer Nikon lenses, and it is very sharp, just like the 14 to 24mm lens. Even wide open at f-stop 4, it is tack sharp throughout the entire image, and this is definitely a great lens with great range, especially for landscape photographers or any sort of wide angle photography. This is a much more standard range, from ultra wide angle to more standard 35mm wide angle. Also, what I like about this lens is how clean it is. That's a great thing about the newer lenses of today. These older lenses have a lot more things you kind of have to do, a lot less control, whereas these are much easier to use and much cleaner on the outside. Another nice thing about this lens is it does have VR. It's the only lens with VR out of all four of these. Now, landscape lenses don't necessarily need VR in my opinion, but if you do shoot in low light handheld, the VR can be a little bit useful as long as it's still life. One of the disadvantages to this lens is that it's an f-stop 4, so it's the slowest lens out of all of these. So, like I said, it's more for just landscape photography, although, like I said, it's very sharp. So even for low light photography, if you can use f-stop 4, it's still very sharp images. Another disadvantage is it's quite large for an f-stop 4 lens. It's just as large and just as heavy as a 17 to 35mm lens, which is an f-stop of 2.8. And that's the next lens I'm going to be talking about here. It's the 17 to 35mm zoom lens. Now, one thing I do like about this is it has pretty much the same range as the 16 to 35mm, except it has an f-stop of 2.8. So a lens like this you would think is better for more low-light photography. And yes, that is true if you really do need that extra stop, but in reality this lens is quite a bit softer than the new 16 to 35mm lens. This lens is tack sharp at its widest f-stop of 4, and even when stopped down to f-stop of 4, this lens is still quite a bit softer, especially in the corners, than the 16 to 35mm lens. If you really need a wide-angle lens for low-light photography and plan on needing the largest f-stop possible, then you might want to consider a lens like this, but if that's not a huge deal, then 16 to 35mm does provide much better image quality. And then finally, the last and largest and heaviest of all the lenses is the Nikon 14 to 24mm f-stop 2.8 lens. One thing that is awesome about this lens, it is Nikon's first amazingly sharp lens. This is probably the best lens, in my opinion, in the world right now, along with the 16 and 35mm lens for wide-angle photography. There's just no lens from Canon or any other company that can match the sharpness of this lens. At 14mm, even wide open and throughout the entire range, it's pretty much tack sharp. Image quality doesn't get any better than this. The only real disadvantages to this lens though are that it's very heavy, much heavier than all three of these other lenses, and it can't take filters at all. Even the 14mm fixed lens can take filters on its back. With this one, you'd have to buy a special holder to have filters in front of the lens. So, which lens is best and which lenses would you want to buy for your Nikon FX camera? Well, we can easily, I think, throw out the idea of getting the 14mm fixed lens. Although it's nice and compact and easy to carry around, it is kind of a specialty lens. Not many people use 14mm anyway, and it's pretty soft, wide open, and it's also very soft, or it has a lot of vignetting, wide open. The sharpness is really only good once you get past f-stop 5.6, and even then the performance of the 14 to 24mm is just so much better. So it's worth just saving up the 14 to 24mm if you need ultra wide angles. The only reason I would purchase something like this is if weight is a real problem for you, or if you really need to have filters on the back. But like I said, the 14 and 24mm does have a holder that'll be able to take filters as well. So that's not as much of an issue anymore. However, the performance of this lens is significantly worse than the 14 and 24mm. So if you need an ultra wide angle lens, 14 to 24mm is the lens to get. Now it's all down basically to these two lenses here. And to be honest, the 16 and 35mm lens is so much sharper and it's such a better performer in terms of image quality than the 17 and 35mm lens that I would also probably take this out of consideration as well. Especially for landscape photography, there's no lens better than 16 to 35mm. It has a great range and it's sharp throughout the entire focal length. Whereas the 17 to 35mm is quite soft at f-stop 2.8 and f-stop 4, and really only sharpens down at f-stop 5.6. So unless you really need a wide-angle lens in this range for low-light photography, I would really just consider getting the 16 to 35mm. Now finally, my favorite lens and what I consider the best of all is the Nikon 14 to 24mm. Now, like I said, if you're a landscape photographer, chances are 16 to 35mm lens is a better choice because it has a much better range and it's just as sharp as the 14 to 24mm lens. The reason I like this lens so much is because of the ultra wide angle lens pictures I can get, and I like being able to do that. It's kind of my style when it comes to landscape photography. But also, if you're a low light photographer and want ultra wide images, then this is definitely the lens to get because, like I said, it's tack sharp, wide open, very fast lens, and great for ultra wide angle sports and low light photography. And this has been a comparison between these four Nikon FX lenses.